Recently, I have finished reading this book. It took me quite a while because it's, a pretty thick book, a brick, as some people say. And no surprise, because it's about the 30 Years' War, which lasted 30 years, so there's a lot to explain. I think that the author, Peter Wilson, did an amazing job, because he did not just focus on Germany, as I think German historians mainly do, but he really put the war in Germany, by the way, the war took place in Germany, into the international context, which, in case of this war, is particularly important. Reading about the 30 Years' War reminded me of one phenomena that I heard about for the first time in the context of civil wars. Namely, civil wars tend to end relatively soon. Worst case, because they simply bleed out. The amount of resources that a country has is limited, and therefore the amount of resources that either side of the conflict has is limited too. But as soon as foreign powers step in and start to support one side or the other, conflicts tend to last longer. Significantly longer. You might have heard about the Contras and the scandal, the so-called Iran-Contra scandal that occurred in the United States. The background was that in Nicaragua, the left-leaning Sandinistas gained power, and the US government didn't like that, and so they started to support various rebel groups. Now, given the background of the Cold War, it was kind of understandable that the Reagan administration was supporting the Contras, those rebel groups, but there were two problems with that. On the one hand, those rebel groups were following terrorist tactics. They were often purposefully aiming at civilians in order to, and were committing atrocities specifically to spread chaos and fear. The other problem is the support from the United States for those minority groups. After all, the Sandinistas had the support of the majority of the population, as far as I understand. So supporting those small rebel groups prolonged the conflict. Eventually, it would last 11 years. A similar situation occurred in Angola. In that country, there have been three major rebel groups which were fighting for the independence of Angola from the Portuguese, because it used to be a Portuguese colony. Now, once the independence was won, there was a conflict for supremacy. Which of those rebel groups will take over the government? And the MPLA proved to be the strongest faction, which took over the control over the capital and the country in general. However, the MPLA was left-leaning, and for that reason, the United States started to support the weaker UNITA. And here, the same effect occurred as in the case of Nicaragua. A conflict that would have ended in a couple of years, probably at most, would eventually last 27 years. On and off, there were breaks, there were ceasefires, but eventually the conflict would end only after 27 years. But the best example, at least that I know of, is the 30 Years' War, which lasted from 1618 to 1648. It is thanks to reading that brick that I showed you that this war would have been over in the first couple of years if there hadn't been international intervention. After the emperor defeated the opposition and re-established his supremacy, the Danes stepped in, and the Hungarians stepped in, and later on the Swedes stepped in, and eventually the French even would march their troops into Germany. And fun fact, even the Polish would be involved, although, next surprise, on the German side, on the emperor's side. The consequence was one of the longest-lasting wars in the history of Europe, and for that reason alone, one of the most devastating. Now, why am I telling you about a war from the 17th century in the context of the current Russian invasion on the Ukraine? Because I realize that there's a similar situation. Both the Ukraine and Russia is being supported by foreign countries. However, there's one element that's completely different than in any other conflict that I mentioned before. In this case, the West is actually supporting both sides at the same time. Well, on the one hand, governments are providing weapons and aid to Ukraine, and many private people are collecting money and donating money to the Ukrainian war effort or to humanitarian purposes. At the same time, we are paying Russia for oil, gas, and coal. I don't know if I ever encountered another situation that was equally absurd. You know, it's morally questionable enough if you support one side of a conflict and because of that prolong the conflict. But you could say, yes, I prolonged the conflict, but, well, I was supporting the side which I thought is in the right. We assumed it was the right thing to do to support that rebel group that eventually has proven to be weaker and lost the conflict. But if you support both sides of the conflict, you inevitably make the conflict last longer, and you can no longer claim, well, I was supporting the side which I thought was in the right. In fact, it's like being an arms dealer that sells weapons to both sides of the conflict, benefiting from it. To some extent, it's literally like that, because as far as I know, all those weapons that are being provided to the Ukraine are, at least predominantly, sold to the Ukraine and not just given away for free. Although I may be wrong with that one, and frankly, I don't know if anyone really knows what's going on behind the scenes. And yet, weapons are being provided to the Ukraine on the one hand, on the other hand, money is being provided to Russia. That's why I say we have to stop buying Russian oil, gas, and coal as quickly as possible. Otherwise, we are collectively guilty of making this war longer and bloodier than it already is. If you want to know the details, here we go. There are two main reasons why we have to stop buying fossil fuels from Russia. The first one is credibility. Imagine you go out on the street to go to the corner shop where you do most of your groceries. The shop is being run by a guy who used to be a hooligan and has been beating up people, but for the last 30 years things were rather calmed down and, well, he became a shop owner. But now you see him kneeling on another guy and beating him up. Now, the funny thing is, you are actually stronger. You could beat that person up, but you're afraid to get engaged because you also know this guy has a knife. And now you have a knife too, but you know, you cannot defend yourself with a knife. If you are starting to use knives, then you're just both gonna get stabbed and you're both gonna die. So that's why you do not want to physically engage. But at least you're not afraid to approach him. So you walk over to this ex-hooligan turned shop owner who's sitting on top of this evidently innocent guy and beating his bloody fist into that guy's face repeatedly. And you say, "Stop that." "Oh, and could I have a package of cigarettes and a six-pack of beer?" Do you see the problem? No matter what we say, no matter what we declare, no matter how outraged we are in our declarations, as long as we keep buying stuff from him, and as long as we keep paying, well, him, in other words, Russia, Putin was not going to believe that we are really serious. Putin is looking back at the West's long track record of saying a lot but doing nothing really. Do you remember the massive cyber attack, which quite evidently was state-sponsored because of the scale of it? The massive cyber attack against Estonia, which paralyzed the country for a couple of days. And there was no real doubt about the fact that this was done by Russia purposefully. Now, there was a lot of, well, not even, I cannot even say a lot of saber rattling. There was some saber rattling. Actually, not even saber rattling. NATO declared that cyber attacks are covered by, well, the NATO Treaty 2 and would require a response. But there was no response. There was no response. Russia wasn't even forced to cooperate on the basis of the usual, cooperation between countries, where Estonia demanded certain people to be turned over or at least to be inquired. Russia just didn't comply with that. Already back then, there should have been sanctions and more and more and more sanctions until Russia would have eventually complied and cooperated with Estonia. But that didn't happen, and that showed to Putin, I can do it again. Then there was the Russian invasion of Georgia, specifically into Abkhazia and southern Ossetia, although also into territories, other territories of Georgia, which are not belonging to these two sub-regions. And, well, guess what? There was a huge shock. There was a huge shock. Oh my God, in the 21st century, a military invasion of this sort. But did anything significant happen? Not really. No, not at all. And this showed to Putin, well, he can go even further. And he did. In 2014, as you will remember, he invaded Ukraine, he invaded Ukraine by taking over Crimea and then somewhat later a part of the Donbas. And again, people were shocked, but nothing significant happened. And if you might say, no, that's not true, there was quite a lot of, severe sanctions against Putin and against his, oligarchs. But you know what Putin said in the very same year, in 2014? He said, Europe cannot just stop buying our oil and gas and coal. There's an expression from politology, credible threat of force, which means when you make a threat, or when you say there are going to be severe consequences if you do something, is it really frightening? Is it really something that could realistically dissuade the side that you try to threaten, or not? There are ample examples from history when threats were not taken seriously and for that reason ignored by the person that was supposed to be impressed. Hitler, for instance, he attacked Poland because he did not believe that Britain and France would really live up to the promises that they made to Poland by signing a defensive pact with that country. He didn't believe it because Czechoslovakia also had a defensive pact with France and Britain, and both countries not only did not help that country, they even helped dismember it. So he assumed that in case of Poland, the same will happen again. This was the direct consequence of the appeasement policy. And guess what? In case of Putin, it's the same. For the last 20 years, Putin is committing more and more severe violations of international law because it was never met with a reaction that would have really been hurtful. That hurtful that he would have taken it seriously. And it's no surprise. As long as we are not even willing to make such a relatively small sacrifice, like hurting our economic interests by stopping to buy fossil fuels from Russia, he doesn't really believe that we are willing to make any bigger sacrifices. That's the first reason why we need to stop buying fossil fuels. Only then will Putin understand that we really mean it. Now I have to take back what I said a little bit, because there is a chance that Putin is impressed by what the West has done so far. As a matter of fact, it's impressive how much the West has done, how many sanctions have been imposed onto Russia in comparison to what happened before. Russia is right now the most sanctioned country in the world, sanctioned even more than Iran. Also, the fact that the West is quite openly selling weapons to the Ukrainians also sends a certain signal. Therefore, Putin has probably gotten the message that we are more serious than we used to be. And yet, as long as we are not willing to do without the Russian fossil fuels, it reduces the credibility of the threat of force. But there's a second reason why we should stop buying Russian oil and gas and coal. Namely, that sanction could actually stop Russia's war machine. Ever since Putin took over power 20 years ago, his aim was to restore the strength of Russia / the Soviet Union. But the interesting thing is, he didn't really make any notable efforts to modernize the economy, to really catch up with the technology of the West. Now, such a modernization process has been happening by itself, if you like, simply because market economy was introduced, but it doesn't really seem as if there was a strategic goal to invest into the modernization of the economy. And yet, Putin invested billions into the rebuilding of the strength of the Russian armed forces. Which then begs the question, where did that money come from? Now, you probably already know the answer, but I will repeat it. The answer is oil and gas exports. Putin's entire political, economical, military system is based on the export of raw materials. Unlike China, which in the last 30 years since the collapse of the Eastern Bloc has been modernizing and turned into the biggest industrial nation of the world, Russia basically has chosen the way of the Arabic OPEC countries. The fortunes of the Russian oligarchs are based primarily on the export of raw materials like gas, oil, coal, wood. Equally, the growth of the Russian economy as a whole is primarily based on the export of raw materials too, primarily gas and oil. More than 1/3 of Russia's budget is based on income from the export of gas. And now comes the best part. 2/3 of those exports go to EU countries. Which means why the EU governments are giving weapons to the Ukrainian to support their defensive effort, and why citizens in the EU are donating humongous amounts of money and of goods to help the people in need or to help the Ukrainian army, the very same countries are transferring millions to Russia as payments for those fossil fuels. As you might have heard before, in general, the Russian economy is very weak. The only reason why Russia was able to build up a military that was capable of carrying out those military actions like the one in Georgia, the one in Syria, and the one in the Ukraine in 2014 are the oil and gas exports. Without those fossil fuel exports, Russia would have never been able to build up the military to the strength that it has today. More importantly, without that money, they would not be able to sustain this war that they are fighting right now for very long. And that means that the money that we are paying for the fossil fuels right now basically mean to drip feed the Russian military machine. Every day that we pay for gas and oil and coal is one day longer the Russians are able to sustain the war. Everyone who buys Russian oil and gas and coal is complicit in the current war. That's why I started this petition. A petition that the EU should decide to stop those imports. Since 2/3 of the exports go to the EU countries, an EU embargo on this import will dramatically reduce the amount of time that Russia can still sustain the war effort. Now, my petition was not particularly successful, with only 4 signatories. In the meantime, there has been another one that was definitely more successful. But there's one problem. Even if there is strong public support for an embargo, I still think that the EU will not impose such an import ban. The reason is this here. Some countries are far more affected by an import ban than others. There are countries which don't import Russian gas at all, and there are countries which import all of their gas from Russia. I think it's safe to say that some countries are basically dependent on Russian gas. Making a transition to other suppliers or to other sources of energy is a costly endeavor. That's why I think that we do need an EU solidarity fund, a fund that will be jointly financed by all member states, but would benefit proportionally those countries the more they are affected by an embargo of Russian fossil fuels. I consider that fund a precondition, a prerequisite for an actual embargo. And that's why I'm doing something unusual for this channel. Rather than just to being educational, trying to spread knowledge, I'd like you to do something. I hereby request that if I could convince you, that you sign this petition and that you share it with others. The sooner we close the valve of money flowing from the EU to Russia, the sooner this war will end.